welcome to this GLASSNET workshop. We'll be focusing on understanding climate impacts on 21st century crop yields, and we'll be drawing on work from the GGCMI Global Gridded Crop Modeling Intercomparison Network. And that network is one of a dozen networks of this network of networks. So GLASSNET is an NSF-funded initiative that seeks to integrate work across these diverse networks, diverse in disciplines, diverse in geographies. So we're featuring today the GGCMI work, but we'll be drawing on members from other networks in order to have comments on this and different perspectives. GLASSNET sponsors early career scholar exchanges for those of you who are early career students, postdocs. Please investigate those on the website. We fund individuals traveling from the US overseas and from overseas to the US doing GLASSNET related work. We have use cases and workshops such as this. We'll be talking about the GeoHub today. That's a very cool vehicle for sharing data, tools, and models. And you'll see one of those tools shared today. We offer short courses in interdisciplinary modeling of sustainability challenges. And I want to draw your attention to a special issue of Environmental Research Letters that came out late last year, focus on global analysis of sustainability. So please visit glassnet.net for more information on this. Today we have a great lineup of speakers. So from the GGCMI group, we have Christoph Müller, who has been leading this group for a number of years, and Jonas Jägermeier. Christoph and Jonas recently published, along with a whole group of collaborators, a paper in Nature Food that documents these latest impacts of climate change on crop yields throughout the 21st century. So Christoph Müller's at PIC, and Jonas is at the Columbia Climate School. Now, how you make these kinds of very sophisticated results available to a wide range of researchers is one of the big interdisciplinary challenges we face in this area. Nelson Deloria, professor at Kansas State University, has been working on this challenge for the last decade. He initiated, along with others, the AgMIP tool, which is featured on the GLASSNET website on the GeoHub. So you'll hear about that inception from him, and then you'll hear from two PhD students at Purdue, Kavitha Srikanth and Elizabeth Frace. In the context of an interdisciplinary course I teach every spring, they said, well, let's use this tool and look at the implications for prices and food security. So you'll hear a little bit about them, about that experience and what they learned from that. Got a great lineup of discussants to talk about the science behind this work. Professor Fran Moore from UC Davis has contributed extensively to the literature on climate impacts and the social cost of carbon. So she'll bring a broad perspective, I'd say, from the integrated assessment modeling community. We've got Matt Huber, who will be bringing the paleoclimate history from way back when we had similarly high CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. How did the world look then? And Frank Evert, University of Bonn, and Salve in Berlin, talking about the crop modeling from with the AgMIP perspective. So that's the lineup, and I'll be riding herd on this group pretty closely to make sure we stay on time and have 30 minutes for discussion at the end. So I'll stop sharing here and ask Christoph to share his screen and take over to tell a little about GGCMI.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and welcome everyone. I take a small lead into the Global Gridded Crop Modeling Initiative, which is one of the many activities happening in AgMIP, the Agriculture Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. And as Tom already said, I lead this together with Jonas for a dozen of years already. And yeah, to just without much further ado, I hope we can actually move forward. Yeah. So in principle, we are there to provide yield data for different crops with global coverage and for different time periods. And of course, this classical climate impact assessment that run into 2100 with a lot of detail on climate scenarios and a lot of bold assumptions on everything else. That's important for agriculture. But we also, in principle, want to look into associated environmental impacts. So what does that mean for the carbon water cycle, nitrogen pollution, and so on? Understand the role of management in that, trying to increase productivity, but at the same time keep environmental impacts at bay or reduce them. We want to look into uncertainties and identify their sources to understand where these uncertainties actually come from. And I can already tell you, much of it comes from the actual crop models, not so much from everything else. And yeah, the AgMIP has this double I in the name for intercomparison and improvement. And I think improvement can only be brought forward through intercomparison, through comparison to real data and also with the models to each other, so you understand where things go wrong in one model or go better in another. There's a huge knowledge gap on management systems, and we're trying to build databases for that as well. So growing seasons, fertilizer application, village systems, and so on. We don't really know how flexible systems are. Currently, we assume they are pretty inflexible. At the same time, we assume much of it is very flexible. And we kind of also have, we'll not go into this today, but we have some good evidence that models are quite right for wrong reasons, and we need to make sure that they're right for the right reasons. So that kind of needs to build on this model intercomparison. Okay, quick history. So we started like 12 years ago when AgMIP started its activity with the first global intercomparison of different impacts, and crop yields were one of those sectors. We have finished phase 1, phase 2, and now are in basically phase 3, which is in line with the AgMIP counting. We publish all our data, input and output data in central repositories. One is the AgMIP database, but also on Zenodo, we have our own AgMIP community, which is mostly GGCMI data, also some other. And from going from a very first assessment, realizing all things are quite different across models, working with economists, with meteorologists, looking into adaptation, how can we emulate things to make impact modeling slimmer, less resource demanding. We're now basically back at the start. So with this remake of feeding our models with the latest CMIP climate inputs. But in principle, beyond this repeated cycle of, okay, new climate scenarios are available, let's see what crop yields would look like under these scenarios. We also have, in principle, the capacity to tap into all these other dimensions shown on the top right that are connected to agriculture production globally. But we have to see how we recruit resources for that and connect to the relevant disciplines. And this is already my last slide. So we really profit from the interaction with networks and other perspectives on agriculture than just like crops grow and produce yield, which is what our models do. All this global way of thinking is very important to us because we need to know how things go at the local scale to understand how we can represent this at global scale activities and where we are off in our assessments. And we've been making use of my GeoHub or GeoShare back in the days, like the platform at Purdue. One is our global crop model evaluation tool, so where people could just upload their data and it would automatically be run through a pipeline as all the other models before. So you can immediately get an impression of how your model compares to observation data, but also to a set of other crop models. I already said land-related input data. We are trying to build that up, and the landing toolbox and the associated data are hosted also in my GeoHub. And then the GGCMI data distribution, and then this is a blend over to basically the next speaker. Jonas will talk a little bit about this very last phase of GGCMI and our future projections there, which are now distributed over my GeoHub and AgMIP, of course. And Nelson will present his awesome tool on distributing, aggregating these data. So I will stop sharing here and hand over to Jonas, I guess.
Jonas, would you like to share a screen?
Yes, I would love to.
So I've introduced everyone before. I don't know whether you were on yet, but Jonas Jägermeyer from the Columbia Climate School, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody, and it's fantastic to see such a turnout. I saw more than 100 participants, so this is fantastic. Let's jump right in. Can you hear me okay? I have a little bit of a feedback. So yeah, thanks, Christoph, for leveling the field a little bit. I want to share some more specific results on that one paper we published now quite some years ago, but it's still a publication that a lot of people use. The data is circulating, and it's still a reference dot on the map. So let's dive in and see what we call it the latest generation of crop and climate models show in terms of climate impacts, long-term climate impacts in global agriculture. The simulation protocol is that we are basically using AgMIP climate forcing. So AgMIP bias adjusted and downscaled 5 CMIP6 climate models. They selected them pretty well. So the average climate sensitivity is representative for CMIP6, more or less. And we ran 3 of the scenarios, a high mitigation scenario, and a high emission scenario, and then we added the SSP3 combined with the RCP 7.0 as a new high emission scenario. The RCP 8.5 is becomes a little bit discarded as very pessimistic. And then that's basically our bread and butter, that we work with the global crop modeling community and invite everybody who can run that kind of protocol to then harmonize their simulation effort. So in this case, we were able to have 12 of these gridded global crop models participate. They all run at a half-degree grid and have a bunch of simulations. So in this case, 240 simulations per crop. And we asked them to harmonize the protocol, use the same inputs, have mandatory prescribed crop calendars that we develop now for this effort. We apply a bias correction, and most importantly, it's a mechanistic modeling approach, so a process-based understanding of planned growth responses to changing climate. So that's opposed to a mechanistic approach where you draw a regression or some sort of machine learning approach. This tries really to capture the biophysical processes happening in the plant. And really important to mention at this point is that we try to isolate the climate signal. So we are not assuming any sort of management adaptation or changing underlying behavior. We hold everything management constant, which is unrealistic. To say it really clear, we do not adapt these kind of simulations. That's another effort that we want to study separately, but these results are based on, they isolate the climate signal to understand what's going on. So at the bottom here, you have the climate models and the crop models. We can always dive in and try to understand what model has what behavior, but there is merit in doing multi-model assessments because there is such a large inherent uncertainty. The more model, the merrier, and when we average them, it turns out that the ensemble average usually performs better than any individual model. All right, let's start off with this is an animation that the NASA news teams created based on these results. It just highlights the whole thing, basically, the full ensemble running out by the end of the century under high climate forcing, RSB 8.5. You know, and as we're going towards the end of the century, you see these substantial differences emerging. Maize shows much larger declines. Wheat shows areas that can potentially benefit, but it really matters in what world region you are. So conclusion, long story short, conclusion is it really matters what you grow and where you grow when it comes to climate change impact. One of the main conclusions and one of the most robust results that isn't directly intuitive from those kind of maps is the latitudinal response. So in lower latitudes, in subtropical, tropical systems, the climate impact on crops is usually larger than at higher latitudes, and that is the same for all crops. Can I ask? There's a little bit of a mic feedback. Can I ask to mute whoever that is? Sorry. Thanks. Okay, so the lower latitudes face largest climate impacts. Same for all crops, and that's a problem because lower latitudes have, for the most part, smaller adaptation capacity. So that's a reason for concern. Now, a little bit more of a technical, complicated figure. This is the kind of bar plot developed for the results, highlighting the full ensemble for high mitigation and a high emission scenario. The main point I want to make here is the difference to the previous round of multimodal assessments that were based on CMIP5. So that's the seminal paper published by Cynthia Rosenzweig in 2014. Conclusion is multimodal average, high emission scenario for maize, end of century, plus 1% response. Okay, and the updated ensemble with new inputs, new assumptions on crop calendars and fertilizer applications, a whole bunch of new models and updated models. So the crop models don't really compare, and new climate forcing, so CMIP6, readjusts the needle from plus 1% to minus 24%, a substantial difference in only a couple of years of advancing the modeling community. So we, one more shout out. I know it happens, but if you could mute it, that was nice. Thanks all. Okay, so the other thing is the uncertainty that I wanted to show here. The range of climate models shown with the dashed line and the range of crop models highlighted with the solid line in a high mitigation scenario. Those ranges, the uncertainty induced by those models is largely comparable. But as soon as we move to a higher emission climate scenario, the impacts uncertainty, the crop model uncertainty, inflates and has a much larger range than the climate model with some models still having a positive response for maize end of century to models indicating a 60% decline. So this makes us a little uncomfortable and indicates that there's a lot of homework for us to do. But the range is still decreased and is much better than in previous simulation rounds. Now for wheat, it's a different story. Wheat is generally expected to see production increases or productivity increases by the end of the century, globally aggregated. And in the new round of simulations, it increased further. So globally, we're expecting a 17% increase, which is attributed to the fact that wheat grows at higher latitudes. So the big wheat breadbasket regions are located at higher latitudes where moderate warming can actually benefit under certain conditions, and wheat is very responsive to CO2, which further drives global crop productivity. I spare wheat and soybean, which are associated with large uncertainties. We can dive in there too if you're interested, but I do want to share a couple of other insights. One is the time of climate emergence metric that we introduced in this publication, which compares the change in mean signal with the historical variability. So once the mean leaves that window of historical variability, we speak of a new norm or an emergence signal. That's important because it has local relevance and it looks at things from a risk perspective. And we can figure out those years, the time when such emergent signals occur, which is basically around the corner for a high emission scenario. And for wheat, we see emergence of positive changes happening basically as we speak. But wheat also shows a peak and decline scenario with a strong increase at first. And then many models show a decline towards the end of century when adverse climate impacts override the CO2 response. But some models still have a very strong optimistic outlook on wheat productivity. We can map those emergence signals, which highlights that in many bread baskets, those emergent years happen very soon in the next couple of decades. And if you want to summarize the areas of current maize cultivated regions, we're looking at a 3/4 of total global maize cultivated areas that see such emergence under the new round of simulations, which is substantially larger than in previous rounds of simulations. Even under a high mitigation scenario, we do see large parts of currently cultivated maize facing new climate pressures. This is for comparison. This is from the AR5 climatic time of emergence for temperature and precipitation, just highlighting that we are speaking of the same kind of range, ballpark. So the years when temperature and precipitation is expected to emerge locally from the historical variability is very similar to what we see in our impacts analyses. So this is in line with the climate community. Now, if we have the time, please come in and stop me if I'm running out of time. But I do want to look under the hood a little bit. And since we're here to dissect these results a little bit and discuss in detail, I want to share with you why these new generation of impacts are so different to the previous round. And the first point is that CMIP6 is warmer than CMIP5. The climate sensitivity in CMIP6 is higher, and there was a lot of discussion about what's realistic in these hot model discussions that you may have heard. So summarized for our impacts study, on average, global land area is 0.3 degrees warmer than CMIP5. But interestingly, it's those areas where we have most productive bread baskets, the temperature difference is even higher, more than ½ degree warmer than CMIP5. So that explains part of it, but not all. The most important part is actually that the crop model sensitivity has changed. So excuse this figure, it's a little complicated, but it basically shows the temperature sensitivity from 1 to 2 degree warming, from 2 to 3 degree warming, and then the net warming impact in CMIP5 and CMIP6. And we see that the warming sensitivity in our GGCMI CMIP6 ensemble is larger. We see larger crop losses under the same amount of warming. And then the net warming is higher, combined with a net warming sensitivity increase. So the impacts in CMIP6 from that associated warming change or temperature change is substantially larger. So it's actually the crop models that introduce a higher sensitivity, combined with the fact that the crop models show a lower sensitivity to CO2, which is good. The crop models are extremely sensitive to CO2, which is a reason for discussion. And in CMIP6, or in GGCMI CMIP6, the CO2 sensitivity comes down a little bit, even though the total CO2 concentration in the CMIP6 scenarios is substantially higher than in CMIP5. All right, last nerdy slide, and then we're done.
Yeah, it's just about time to wrap up, Jonas. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, Christoph spoke of the fact that crop models introduce the largest amount of uncertainty. And this stack highlights the fact dramatically. So this is for GGCMI CMIP5. We see that 97% of the total uncertainty is introduced by the crop models, and only 3% by the crop models. Sorry, I misspoke. 97% by the crop models, 3% by the crop models. Now in the new ensemble, that becomes a little bit more balanced. Still, the crop models introduce 69%, the largest amount of uncertainty, but it is much better than before in relative as well in absolute terms. That's the same for all the other crops. So things go in the right direction, but there's still homework to be done. Okay, we spare this another way of evaluating things in terms of standard deviation and variability, but CMIP6 looks much better than CMIP5 in terms of variability. This is a figure from the IPCC report, just flexing, but that's okay. And the final conclusions, I think, are clear. The climate signal is more pronounced than previously expected due to the facts I laid out. Climate emergence is a thing and is expected to happen very soon. Impacts are largest and most negative in lower latitudes. And one point I want to make here in this community is these data are here. It's a huge ensemble. It's a huge archive. We can't write all the papers we want or we would like to see. So this is a call to everybody. If you would like to work with such data, please reach out. We're very happy to support and give you access to the data and even give you ideas for fun paper ideas that we can write either together or you just come in and get the data and do whatever. Thanks for your time. That's it.
Thanks, Jonas. That was great. Nelson, how can people access, and particularly non-climate scientists, access this information?
All right. Thanks, Tom, Christoph, and Jonas for the previous presentation. I want to go quickly over this AgMIP tool that it's on the GeoHub that precisely helps with accessing this data. This is work with Jonas, Christoph, Jason Beckman from the USDA ERS, who has been funding this work of putting this online. I look and learn from Purdue and myself. The motivation for this data, it's from an economic model perspective, is that we use the data aggregated to regional levels. And the formats in which this data come are not necessarily familiar to economists and other non-specialists. And then these are large volumes of data, especially disaggregated. So downloading it, pre-processing it, it's challenging. So what we set out to do is, well, how to make the data available to users. And we actually started this some 10 years ago with the first generation of the GGCMI yield shock. We had the tool that you can see here to the left. That's the older tool with all the crops they had. The climate models, crops, etc. That was published in the paper that is there. But what was interesting was, the level of use of this data. So by the end of the life of this tool, we had 340 users and 71 and almost 72,000 downloads of this data. So in some point, we had done this for the first generation of the data. Jonas and Christoph agree on having this for the newer sort of data, and that's the tool on GeoHub, and the presenters after me are going to discuss that a bit better. But it's basically a graphical user interface that allows accessing these models. All the archive is there. We do have by default downloading the mean of the ensemble of models for the reasons John has discussed already. There are some basic aggregation possibilities here to the country region, to the agroecological zone region. There are opportunities to do this in a customized way by uploading a shapefile. There are some pretty basic visualization capabilities. Really, the point of the tool, it's download and aggregation more than visualization, but this helps to understand the data, in this case, maize to 2054 at the AZ level, the agroecological zone level. And it's been interesting. We released that later last year, and since then, there are 63 simulation users. Probably 10 of those, it's us, the team. So around 50 new users have started working with the tool, and there have been 200 downloads in these few months, a few of which I believe we are going to see in the next presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing here, Tom, and back to you.
Fantastic, Nelson, and thanks to you and all the team for making these results available to all of us who aren't sophisticated climate scientists. So I'd like to turn it over now to Elizabeth and Kavitha, two PhD students at Purdue, who said, hey, we're talking about this in this interdisciplinary class. Let's go and run it and use that with a simple economic model. So over to you guys.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tom. So welcome everyone to our part of the workshop session today. It's entitled Climate Impacts on Crop Yield Projections, incorporating the new GGCMI CMIP 6 projections. And today we'll explore how climate change affects crop yields and how you can use this to advance your own research. So next slide. So this is, again, just like a brief overview of the tool itself, highlighting sort of the specifications. And I just want to highlight here the options that you have. I know we just went over this, but the all crop model versus the individual crop model, and then the individual climate models broken into 5 different groups, and then the RCP selection as well as the crop selections. Next slide. I think we can skip this. We just went over this, but and skip to the simple slide. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So we utilize this tool to collect data on climate shocks to agriculture in order to create a shock for the simple model. So we utilize an ensemble mean of the following specifications to create a total product factor productivity shock that is then implemented into a partial equilibrium model of global trade called SIMPLE. So it's the simplified international model of agricultural prices, land use, and the environment that aggregates across all crops. So we collected data across using the all crop version, and then across all 5 climate models and all 4 crops with the RCP of 8.5. And then this model, it's simple, uses an aggregated crop, so we're able to apply this shock using that. Next slide.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I'm just going to quickly talk about what we do in Simple and present like one specific result. So this is broadly the aggregation approach we use. So we get data at the country level, basically quite disaggregated for economists like us. So we first aggregated by time over 30 years to be able to compare to the historical climate. And then we also weigh by a production share. So that's just a quantity share of the country to the region. And weighing by the production share gives us the ability to look at these shocks by different crops. I'll just show that in the next slide. And then we can also, to aggregate it to one crop, which is the input for Simple, we use a value share. So it's just a price quantity share of that country in the Simple region. So I'll show both of those. So this is the shocks if we stopped at the 3rd step, which is to just weigh it at the quantity share. So you can see, I mean, of course, as we already saw, that the shocks by crop are quite heterogeneous. This is aggregated across the regions that Simple takes, which is about 17 regions. And we're just highlighting two specific regions here, which is Australia, New Zealand, and US. So as you can see, the biggest bar corresponds to the largest staple crop, and you can also see that reflected when we combine it together in terms of the directionality and magnitude of the impacts for these two regions, which is that there's a much larger positive change in yield for Australia, New Zealand versus a negative change for the United States. And we input this information into Simple, and we can look at a lot of different indicators. What we're talking about here is just the crop prices. So we already have a baseline that incorporates the SSP2 projections, TFP growth projections, and so on. And we do add the climate shocks, the productivity shocks in it. It's basically a supply curve shift. And once we do that, we look at it under integrated and segmented markets. So under integrated markets, we see that the global price of staple crops falls by about 4%. And regionally, which we do through segmented markets, you can see the differences between the regions. And this is working in the same mechanism of the demand and supply. So because we saw increase in yield in Australia, New Zealand, we see proportionally quite high decrease in crop prices. Yeah, so it's a lot more heterogeneous than some of the previous results we had, so we thought it was interesting. To conclude, we've learned a lot through these through the process of the tool. It was my first modeling exercise, so it's very exciting. For me, it's been invaluable. For economists, it's provided us with a lot of data sets. It's also provided us with an aggregated version of the data set that we can use to be able to directly input into our models and come out with insights. So it's been very interesting, and I thank you all for listening. So,
Great, thanks, Elizabeth and Kavitha. That was very interesting and very striking that you're, as students in this class, able to use this tool to actually draw out some implications for the global food economy. So we're now going to move into the discussion phase, and we'll start with Fran Moore, UC Davis. Fran, tell us your perspective on this.
Thanks, Tom. Can you see everything okay? You see?
We're good.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for putting together a really interesting discussion. So I thought I'm going to bring the perspective of kind of thinking about integrating these into what economists call the social cost of carbon. So for those of you not familiar with this is the essentially a measure of the externalized cost of a ton of CO2 emissions. And so it's, we think of it as if like marginal cost of additional emissions. And so it's kind of calculated in this like fairly simple way, but what you have to do is you kind of have to track the effects of an additional emissions pulse kind of through the climate system, then through the social, economic, ecological systems into damages, and then kind of aggregate them up over time, over space, and over sectors in order to get this like summarized value. And so what we're talking about here kind of is like, this is a representation of that. And so we're kind of interested in this like damage function here, where essentially we're kind of pulling together everything we know about climate change impacts across all these different sectors. And I've kind of put a number of them here. And in this, in this application, we're kind of thinking about, okay, what is the like, what are the agricultural impacts of climate change, and how do those kind of aggregate up into the social cost of carbon? So and one of what's tricky about this application is that you need to be kind of comprehensive in your damage functions, right? So they have to be global. They have to be sectorally comprehensive. And so that means for the agricultural sector, ideally many crops, ideally livestock. Although we know that that's really hard, as well as, and kind of think about not just temperature effects, but CO2 and potentially also precipitation. And so it's kind of tricky to work with some of the pre-existing information here. And so I'm just talking about a process we went through that started almost 10 years ago at this point, where we drew on kind of two separate data points. And the first one was we really looking, kind of trying to tie to the IPCC AR5 reports. And so in their food security chapter, they had kind of gone through and done this really great, pulling together a lot of the point estimates, mostly from process-based yield models. There are a few empirical studies in there, but it's mostly these process-based models that we've been talking about. And we kind of essentially aggregated that and built what is a very, very, very simple emulator of that kind of ensemble response that you're like getting from this like collection of studies. And that's like, and from that we can like then extrapolate globally. And then this was kind of just as we were like wrapping up this part of the paper, the GGCMI, like the first round of results came out. So we kind of also pulled those in and looked at, an ensemble from that modeling that had both the temperature and CO2 response. And then in order to get all the way through to kind of this social cost of carbon point, we needed to take these yield shocks, right? And as we've just seen in the previous presentation, kind of aggregate them up so that we can estimate these economic responses, where here we use the GTAP CGE model with 140 regions, and then push that through into an integrated assessment model that has the climate system in there as well. Because this is about this kind of intercomparison, these are some figures from the supplement of this paper, where we're looking at what we got, like the differences between our meta-analysis and this previous version of the GGCMI. This is for 2-degree warming. I just pulled out wheat. What you're seeing is like differences in the central estimates, and in particular, our model tended to be pessimistic, like the meta-analysis model tended to be pessimistic in places like Northern Europe, and more optimistic in places like Africa. We had a less differentiated geographic response. But what I want to estimate is like tracking these uncertainties through is really important in these applications, because you get a lot of compounding non-linearities in the system as you push it through like various different modeling steps. And if you look at the uncertainty ranges, then what this is showing, there's basically overlap everywhere in the at least the uncertainty bounds. And so like pushing this through, this is now welfare effects, right? So kind of taking that up to the regional level and then kind of pushing it through this like CGE model so we can account for like various adjustments in trade and production, consumption. And what you're seeing here is for these different regions, our meta-analysis with the error bars is in the solid line. And then the AgMIP is we're seeing in the dotted line. And you're seeing like, in some cases, we match very similarly. So particularly in like these lower latitude regions, like take a look at like South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. And in other places, like you're seeing kind of much more positive effects in from the AgMIP. So like Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union. In general, like just to note, like you're seeing these big positive effects in the exporters, right? Because in this simulation, the prices are generally going up. But look at also note the big nonlinear, like the big effects of these, like the non-symmetric nature of these error bars. And so it's really important to like keep tracking that as it goes forward in the modeling through the social cost of carbon. So once we pulled that all together, what we saw is this like, sign change in what, in the kind of net social cost of carbon effect from what the previous generation of models, this fund model that had represented this showed largely benefits in agriculture. Oops, sorry. We kind of found negative effects, which are larger in our meta-analysis than using the AgMIP yield changes. So what more I guess my question, like that I would be interested in hearing from the other panelists, and maybe we could address in discussion, would be, would more recent studies change findings? And in particular, how should we understand the kind of GGCMI results in the context of like this broader space of agricultural impacts on climate change, and particularly the IPCC? So I went back, I was kind of looking at the IPCC like AR6 like what does the food security chapter have to say? And it says like in most regions, and there's some caveats, but most regions that say like we have observed negative impacts of climate change so far on crop productivity. And then like their projections, which are kind of based on the similar, my understanding is a kind of similar like aggregation of studies from across the literature, with, you know, caveats and asterisks, but like largely if you look at the effects of temperature and CO2, there's a kind of lot of mass below zero going out. And so I guess my question is, you know, we are thinking about updating this work, which I think, you know, social cost of carbon should be tied to definitely like the latest understanding of climate change impacts. So if we're kind of looking to update this work for these global economic applications, what is the best evidence on future climate change effects on ag productivity? You know, how should we characterize these uncertainties and kind of propagate them going forward? What's the best practice for that? And then how should we understand the GCMI results in this kind of broader context of like the IPCC and AR6? I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Fran. Jonas and Christoph, you might make a few notes. I'll come back to you after the discussion round before we go to the broader Q&A. I wanted to turn next to Frank Evert. Frank, longtime AgMIP participant, but outside of this particular study, I wondered whether, wanted Frank to make some comments as well from that perspective. You're muted. You're muted.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me and welcome everyone. I will give some sort of perspective from crop modeling activities into this discussion. Some of it relates to AgMIP, not everything, but many of the activities have some relationships to what has been said here, particularly refer to points that have been made with respect to crop model sensitivity, uncertainty, adaptation not being addressed in the study, some of the aggregation comments that have been made, and the broader impact in the context of food systems. When we talk about crop modeling in the context I have been involved in within AgMIP, we very much deal with point-based application of crop models, though with a global coverage. And in that context, it would eventually be interesting to compare the results obtained here with point-based models and see to which extent we align or whether we have differences. What we try to understand with our activities is basically to grasp to which extent models are able to represent the genetic diversity, management diversity, and also adaptation issues in impact studies with respect to yield and also other variables. Improve parameterization and in that respect also reduce model uncertainty. We know that there is a lot of variability in the systems we are looking at. Temporal variability, there's also spatial variability, up to very small scale spatial variability. And we also know that our traits are usually at a very specific point where we had to look at, and that has concerned us to a large extent in order to understand that uncertainty that comes with the upscaling and aggregation of data across space and spatial and temporal scale. And we have done a number of studies. That's a short summary. More recently, we have also looked into the aggregation of traits and the errors that comes with the aggregation of traits in the impact assessment studies. One other issue that has received our attention was to which extent are we able to reproduce the effects of extreme events. And here you see two extreme events that we had in recent years in 2003 and 2018 in Germany, very severe events. And we have seen impacts on different crops, though the effects on the different crops varied. And if you consider more years, also extreme years, we could see that this variability across crops and regions is also quite considerably. Nevertheless, we thought we'd be able with crop models to reproduce that quite well, but only to some extent we were able to do that. And this summary representation of the quality of the models, we compared crop models. This is the green line, process-based crop models with artificial intelligence methods, in this case, support vector machines. This is the yellow line. The support vector machines perform better for the crops that we looked at, even under conditions of climate change, where we thought we have a clear signal. That brought us to the insight that there are other factors that need to be considered, not only from that perspective, but also from that perspective. And one example here is excessive rainfall with different pathways through which this is mediated to affect crop growth and yields. So that really stresses the need to advance crop modeling for the range of factors that we are not addressing, and in order to consider those factors in our assessment, and probably also use other methods than crop modeling in order to address these factors. This becomes even more important if we look at present policy developments in the context of how to develop future production systems in Europe, quite importantly in the light of the European Green Deal that several of you may know, that sets quite concrete targets with respect to the reduction of pesticide use and mineral fertilizers, just to give a few examples. And in that context, we would need to understand how this affects the entire food system, and also to which extent we address these reduced intensive systems in our modeling activities. So we have heard the food system perspective already. That's an interesting perspective. I think we need to consider that in impact assessment studies, perhaps not so relevant in this discussion, but in the broader scale. And we also know that different types of agricultures are out there, for instance, agroecology, but also sustainable intensification, that try to address these reduced intensification issues, but to which extent we are able to reproduce them with our crop models, it's a challenge and something that we need to address, and to be able to cope with sort of management practices such as intercropping, mixed cropping, relay cropping, patch cropping, agroforestry systems, and agrophotovoltaics. And to the very end, I want to make the point of the reference to a initiative that we've also recently started that not only focus on modeling, but more on data and data infrastructures and research data management, which is absolutely critical and essential, and perhaps a link back to the topic of this meeting here. This initiative is called Fair Agro, and we are very open to interact with anything that's discussed here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank. Maybe we should have a workshop on Fair Agro at some point. Please keep that in mind. That was very useful to get that point-based perspective on this. Lastly, I wanted to turn to my colleague at Purdue, Matt Huber, who gave a lecture in the very same course where Kavitha and Elizabeth were making this presentation. And he said, well, I know all about worlds in which CO2 affects strong CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. I'm a paleo guy, so Matt, tell us about that.
Sure, yeah, let me share my screen here. Yeah, I mean this to be a thought-provoking little exercise. It may not make everyone happy, but I hope everyone will find it interesting. So, I would just start by saying, as Tom alluded to, I was motivated by this recent paper, and and obviously this sort of discussion has been the focus of what people have been talking about. And I guess one of the things that I noted when I saw this paper was, well, of course, I mean, this is all pretty obvious because paleoclimate data already tells us that this is exactly what's going to happen. So that seemed to be a bold statement, Tom felt. So I think he felt like I should now make that bold statement to everyone else. So just using this as a motivation, and what I'm going to show you looks fairly hand wavy, but it doesn't actually need to be, and I'll show you how it's not hand wavy at the end. But you know, I just wanted to bring this little classic cartoon up of the person on their hands and knees feeling around in the dark underneath a light, and you know, they are looking there because that's where the light is, not necessarily because that's where they lost their keys. And I just want to suggest to everybody that I feel like this community is actually maybe not taking advantage of all the light that there is. And they're spending an unnecessary amount of time fumbling around in the dark for how do plants and ecosystems behave at higher CO2 and in a warmer world. Because we have many, many examples of that from paleoclimate. So, and we actually know when these plants evolved and how they evolved and what conditions caused them to be selected for. So we can use that information. So what I would like to do is just suggest that people who are trying to do this in the future should probably spend more time looking at the extensive records that we have in the past. So I'm going to show mostly other people's work, a little bit of my own, but just a reminder that C4, you know, which is a major biophysical way of being for many of our crops, is not a way of being that always existed. And in geological terms, it's fairly recent. As an ecosystem, C4 grasslands really only expanded in the past 10 million years. And actually, a number of the things that are important for crops only appeared in the past 1 to 2 million years. So they're a relatively recent innovation, and there's been a long-standing question whether was that innovation due to needing to respond to CO2 pressures and changes in water use efficiency due to CO2 pressures, or was it climate mediated? That area of scientific study has come to, you know, really a major conclusion in the past 5 to 7 years, which is that it's mostly CO2 driven. We now have excellent records of CO2 and climate through time. And that's what I'm showing here on the right. On the top, the blue line are global records of CO2 over the past 60 million years, where 2022 is indicated with a little arrow. So, you know, values are around 400 parts per million. You have to go back to this period of time before grasslands existed as an ecosystem, okay, to have a CO2 value in the range that we're likely to have in the next 50 to 100 years. All right, so we actually know what the climate looked like, what the hydrological situation looked like, what precipitation was. We actually know all of that, and we know when there was a transition towards C4. It's a very strong constraint. And interestingly, it happens around the world over a relatively short period of time. This is a recent paper, Nature Geosciences by Pertigia Palisar et al. And they compile all the data when C4 as an ecosystem appears in the geological record. And they also have a bunch of paleo-environmental constraints from isotopes, which tell us what were those plants responding to: CO2, changes in water vapor, and or changes in nutrients. So those are just some examples of paleoclimate records. You can then work with communities, which is one of the things that I do, build scientific communities that are looking at everything, compiling data from the oceans, from land, paleobotanists, paleovertebrate specialists, people working on ice volume through time, compile a ton of information. I know this is a lot here. I don't expect you to get it all, but I'm hoping we can make this available and you can look at it and look at the evolution of, in the world I live in, it's often plant functional types, but this could be biomes, this could be agricultural zones, and map out where did they evolve and under what conditions did they evolve. So this is all really useful constraints, and it's not to say the data is perfect. There has to be like really good frameworks for incorporating this information, but it's not like we have zero information about how plants behave in the world as it is 3 degrees, 5 degrees warmer, and with 500, 600, 800 parts per million CO2. We actually have tons of information about this. And, you know, to get away from the hand waving and down more to the quantitative level, There are some groups that have developed vegetation models, plant physiology, and growth models that incorporate a number of these effects, like the competition between water use efficiency and nutrient availability, and using optimality frameworks to allow plants to optimize for these different situations. And then comparing, many groups do that, obviously, but then comparing against this paleoclimate information. And what we find is that by suitably choosing the easily unknown from unconstrained parameters from modern observations, choosing them so that they fit paleo, we can get the transition from C3 to C4 grasslands correctly. So in other words, we can sift through the kind of very large parameter space within these veg models and reproduce the transition from C3 to C4 at the right CO2. That information is fundamentally important if you want to be projecting into the future. So this is a doable thing. And I always go over, so I'm going to try and end here with just a set of recommendations, which is that, broadly speaking, we should really be incorporating all of this information. These plants evolved their current way of being relatively recently. And we have a whole body of information on how they responded to CO2 and climate change in the past. And just at the most basic level, we know that adding CO2 is going to push us towards C3 versus C4. And if you at mid and high latitudes, when you add the temperature effect onto that, that actually enhances that effect substantially. So I just encourage people to start working with their local friendly paleo person who can probably say, we've known a lot of this for a long time. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Great, great perspective. That's what these workshops are all about, bringing novel perspectives to. So, yeah, I'd like to circle back to Jonas and Christoph and let them respond briefly. I underscore briefly, and then we'll go to a broader discussion amongst the panel and with the audience. So, Jonas, I see you've come off of.
Sure.
Jump in.
Yeah, Matthew, that was amazing. That was really cool. Much appreciated. I would definitely want to learn more about the paleo context. Really cool. Okay, so I didn't really closely monitor the chat. There were a bunch of really good questions and comments. Christoph did a better job in responding, so I recommend that those points that weren't sufficiently addressed or something that really stands out, please speak up, because it's kind of difficult on a small screen to scroll between different response trees, and it's kind of messy. So I would encourage, if you have the time, to put some of the really good stuff happening in the chat into a discussion here. Let's see, a couple of responses to Francis. So I want to be careful with my tone responding to the IPCC Working Group 2 food chapter, because I respect their tremendous amount of work and just the nature of summarizing and synthesizing everything is so important. But we felt there were a couple of shortcomings in methodological challenges that made some of the meta-analysis they published themselves and then based much of the chapter on that meta-analysis very difficult. One aspect was, for example, that the averaging of the different studies in the meta-analysis was just a plain average, and they average across a point-based data point and a globally gridded multimodal assessment with the same weight, which is difficult in my eyes. And a bunch of other things that we can unpack a little bit. Also, I haven't thought about it in detail in quite some time, so I need to refresh my notes there too. But I just want to say, some of these meta-analysis figures aren't necessarily in line with what I think the current state of art is. And then the figure you showed on temperature response, of course, if you increase temperature and don't change anything cultivar or don't change CO2 concentrations, the expected yield response is negative for
That was temperature and
acre.
CO2.
Oh, okay. Then I misread. It's the x-axis was just temperature, I thought. But you know, broadening that up to the wheat modeling community, and Frank and others can probably speak to that more. I think the general conclusion is if you increase temperature, yields are expected to go down, and if you include CO2 too, then it becomes much more uncertain. But at globally aggregated level, the recent bottom line is wheat shows increases. If in our GGCMI models we hold CO2 constant, that's a standard default experiment we do to understand the CO2 effect, we reproduce the negative wheat yield responses that are found in experiments and in the literature body pretty well. So wheat yield goes down under temperature, and as soon as we include CO2, they go up. And then you had a larger question how to frame these results and place them in the larger context. We can discuss that more. I want to let others speak too. But I just want to finish in saying that there is a bunch of important blind spots in current process-based modeling that could potentially underestimate adverse climate impacts in these results. And to name a few is flooding, excess moisture and soil moisture, waterlogging, and inundation. Physical damage from flooding is basically not represented at all, and we know that that's a big issue. The response to certain extreme events isn't adequate. We know that the models aren't as sensitive as they should be to heat waves and droughts. So there's a lot we can talk about. Ozone isn't represented. The CO2 response is very, very high, even though that experiments support that. We don't know if that can be realized in the field globally. So there's a lot of things we could talk about. But yeah, I'll stop here.
Christoph, over to you. And could you respond, Christoph, to, since you also work with the MAGPIE group, those results that showed prices at mid-century, so 2050, so historical climate, mid-century climate, prices actually falling overall for this cluster of staple crops. Is that surprising to you? It was surprising to me, which is kind of the genesis of this whole workshop, thanks to Kavitha and Elizabeth. But Christoph, do you want to respond to that and anything else? There were also questions about short run versus long run and whatnot.
Yeah, I can try to answer that, but one aspect is certainly the missing processes and damage mechanisms that Jonas just pointed to. Our crop models are definitely too optimistic with respect to projecting future climate change impacts. So that needs to be considered. Like back in the days, that was accounted for by just saying, okay, we take the simulation where CO2 is not accounted for and believe that's the more realistic projection of future climate change. But then that's not a good move. You could also say we increase temperatures by 5 to account for all the processes that are not included. So that doesn't really work. So I think we've made a good move in kind of including CO2 fertilization the standard, because that's what's happening. But now we need to make a good move and kind of include all the processes that are actually not included in the models or not represented in a mechanistic manner. In that manner, well, we're trying to find resources for that and capacity to do so. And then if you put like a lot of different signals into an optimization model, the optimization model is bound to find a good solution because that's what it's made for. So I think the core question in agriculture is really on how flexible are systems, and we don't really know. And And I think in economic assessments, the flexibility is probably overestimated. And in these mechanistic crop modeling perspectives, the flexibility is underestimated because we usually assume that the farmer is not responding at all. It's just the plant responding, which is obviously wrong. But that's like what we do. And then the missing processes, maybe also that's like a counterbalancing error. But yeah, shortly speaking, I think we're still pretty blind in what future climate change will actually mean for future agriculture and for all the challenges that agriculture will have to address in the coming decades anyway, independent of any climate change. So yeah, take all this with a grain of salt, what you see, and basically try to understand the dynamics you see rather than specific 5% or 10% or something. And also use all this, and I think that's also a value of this GLASSNET network of networks. Also use the feedback from people using the data and kind of plugging it into their models, and whatever they find, if they find it's implausible what they get, it could be their model, but it could also be our data that has been fed into it. So that needs to be like, it needs to be a joint learning journey somehow. And having this feedback on, okay, if I use your data, I get this result, and let's jointly discuss it, what it means and why that's plausible or not, would be hugely beneficial for a scientific community as such, I think.
Thanks, Christoph. I noticed John Porter's been very active. Do you want to chime in, John, at all? Not to put you on the spot, but you're muted right now. You're welcome to come off mute and make a few comments if you like, from IPCC perspective.
From an IPCC perspective, I think one of the things that is, I think one of the things that we tried to do in AR5 in the food security chapter was to open up the remit of that chapter, and I think we did a reasonable job. I think they actually did a better job in the chapter that came in 2018 with Cynthia and people. But I think that what you have to understand really is that when you write an IPCC chapter, you're basically, the only data you can use are the data which have been published. So you can't, if there are elements missing like ozone or temperature, CO2 interactions, if there are no data about that, then you can't write an evaluation about it. So this is where I think that this organization actually kind of fills in the gaps, which is really, really good. So I think that is really important, but I think you need to to be really upfront about that. The second thing I would also, I did try to put a note in about costs and marginal costs of climate change, and I think, as far as I understood, maybe I misunderstood the presentation, but I think that you have to take account of the fact that there can be trade-offs between these costs, and that for instance, if you have high mitigation, if you use a lot of money for mitigation, then your damage costs are going to be lower. And we did write a paper many years ago now trying to examine the relationship between these particular trade-offs. And what our conclusion was then, maybe Frank can remember the guy I did this work with. We found out that actually the adaptation costs were the critical. I mean, if you're looking at trying to get down to a reasonable level of CO2, then, and also the damage, the costs of that, then I think adaptation costs prove to be the thing that you really need to concentrate on. So yes, I think there is some. I don't know whether I had any. One of the other. Oh yes, the final thing I'd like to say is that from Frank's presentation, really, I think. And you may already be doing this, but I think that we really need to have a good idea about how do you future-proof crops for climate change. I know that's a big interest at the moment in CIMMYT in Mexico. I know they're really trying to think about how can they future-proof. And that may be thinking more about cropping systems than actually idiotypes, individual crop types. So I think there's a discussion to be had about what are the properties or what are the traits as Frank mentioned it, what are the traits in breeding that you might want to look at if you are going to try and future-proof crops against climate change. I think that's a better way to go, because I think that there's too much conversation about resilience. I think resilience is the wrong thing to be thinking about, because resilience is if something goes wrong, then we can try and fix it. I know that Holger Meinker in Tasmania has the same idea as me, that what we should be looking at is our robust cropping systems, i.e. we try to prevent rather than cure. So we want to have robust cropping systems which avoid the problems happening in the first place. So I think those are the three main points I would like to contribute with.
Thanks, Sean. Very helpful. Let me call out Frank Evert. Frank's been cited a number of times here. I was thinking about him before Jonas raised his hand. Go to Jonas, but then I'd like Fran also to comment, given your work, Fran, on mitigation versus impacts. I know you've thought about that a lot as well. So maybe the three of you can circle through briefly and touch on some of these points that have been raised. Frank, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I'll probably start with the adaptation, because that was the last comments John tried to make, and to which extent the climate-proof crops or cropping systems. I think this is an issue of increasing relevance, to which extent or what is the level of how we assess or try to understand the response of our systems, of our crops. Is it really at the level of individual crops? Is it at the level of cropping systems? Is it at the level of landscapes, perhaps? To which extent there should be some robustness, if I stay with that term. We don't get into the discussion of resilience versus robustness, but if I stay with that term. So what you can have a good robustness at the agro-system level, at the landscape level, while individual crops may be very weak and very responsive to individual signals of climate. So you really would like to understand that in the more complex system level, I think. And that also brings me to what one colleague stressed in the presentation. I forgot where it was, the food system level, really in that more integrated perspective of ensuring food security, because that's why we do all that, and delivering product for food market, but also for other markets. To which extent this whole system has robustness when it comes to changes in variability and also transient changes in the climate, and also other changes. Yeah, that's one comment. I don't want to spend all the time here too. There are many other aspects that have been addressed.
Okay, save your next one. We'll come around to you again if time permits. Jonas, you have your hand up.
Let's hear from Francis. I have a couple points after.
Yeah, I would just, so on the like connections to mitigation and adaptation. So on the adaptation, so I think we know the social cost of carbon should include theoretically the net benefits of adaptation. So it should include the costs and the benefits. I think we know we're not very good at that. So in the work I presented, we tried our best to get the the benefits of things like planting date and cultivar change to the extent they're represented in the like underlying data. What then happens, like when that goes into GTAP, you get a whole bunch of adaptations in the economic system coming out of that CGE modeling, because GTAP is an equilibrium model. If there's any kind of transition costs associated with that, so there's any kind of frictions, so like it could assume that like production is moving, for example, within a country, and so if that is like slow or costly, that's a piece that we're definitely missing. On the mitigation side, so the social cost of carbon, like conceptually, is like it's an impacts measure. So it's used to evaluate those trade-offs. So it's used to evaluate, like, on the margin, like what would be a cost-effective, like a welfare improving mitigation strategy. So, like, you know, it's like where would you set a carbon tax? Is like the simplest example. It's a little like it is defined with respect, because it's a marginal valuation, it is defined with respect to the an underlying emissions pathway, those underlying emissions pathway, and so it is sensitive to that, and so like those have embedded within them like mitigation costs, but it kind of doesn't appear directly in the SEC, but the SEC is something you can then use to like evaluate trade-offs across like different mitigation pathways. And you could use different SECs along different mitigation pathways to kind of compare them to.
Thanks, Fran. Jonas, you wanted to take us in a new direction?
Yeah, a little bit, 3 points. Let's see if I can remember. I kind of want to wrap up this question. Where do we place these results, current modeling estimates? You know, and my take on it is there was also a question asked in the chat. What, you know, I think model development will, you know, narrow down the uncertainty range and probably bring down some of these very optimistic results or some of these very pessimistic, you know. So there's important development on ozone and flooding and all these things. And by the way, the funding landscape is really difficult. You know, you don't get funding to advance your model. You get funding to write a fancy study. But, you know, it's rare that, and Christoph and I actually just have a grant on flood development, moisture development, and frost in the model. So that's rare. We just have a paper accepted that shows the institutional difference between the climate modeling community and the crops and impacts community. You know, a whole institute, hundreds of employees support a climate model, maintain and run it. And then one person in its postdoc and PhD run a crop model. So there's an institutional difference here too. So that will narrow down a little bit. But I think the bottom line message is climate change will create winners and losers in agriculture. And that's something we need to, you know, get more comfortable with the idea that there can also be positive responses under moderate climate change. So yeah, just leave it at that. I just came back from a workshop at Corteva in Indianapolis, which is a main breeding company, and I presented those results in that kind of community, you know, and the response was very different. They walked up to me and said, okay, I mean, how do you reconcile your steep declines with the historical increases? I know you don't include management, but we've been revolutionizing agriculture all over again, and we have no doubt that we will do that in the future too. So their standing is very tech solution oriented, and they are very confident that breeding will solve much of that, and their projections for crop yields are just going up as they did for the last decades. So that was also something that I haven't really realized, that, you know, the disconnect between the communities, and I would love to see that more, that we're closely collaborating with breeders and try to get the new you know, genetic material into the models and place them in a new climate reality and see how far they can go. My third point is I want to emphasize really quick that we're only looking at long-term average changes, and I want to highlight Liz and Kavita's presentation on prices, which I really enjoyed. I think there's something to be said about increasing variability too, not just average yields. So even though prices may decline because of some crop yield long-term increases, you know, very bad years followed by a good year can average out, but can destabilize the system too. So I think it's important to study variability and resilience and not just 30-year average changes.
Jonas, that, you know, Coda Fran in 2 seconds there. That was an issue that came up in the discussion frequently, short run effects. And I in the comments, I mentioned that the simple framework is designed for decadal analysis. It's not a short run commodity market story where stock holding and that kind of thing would be extremely important. But perhaps, Fran, you were raising your hand, maybe you were thinking about that or something else, but There is this question
Yeah,
of short
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe we could just kind of wind things down the last 5 minutes talking about these short run effects. Fran and then Frank.
Yeah, I guess I had a couple thoughts in response to Jonas's points. So yeah, so one so the short run variability is really interesting, and I think it is like this is like I know Michael Roberts and Wolfram Schlenker have been thinking about this and thinking about, okay, because these are commodities that can be stored largely, and so like what does that storage response do, and how does that then moderate like things like price and consumption variability is like pretty important. The winners versus losers, that comes out even more in when you start looking at the price effects. So like because you have these like terms of trade going on, that you know, it's not just about where the like yields are changing, but like where the relative yields are changing, and then how that like interacts with the country's like export position. And then finally, like this point about like yields is still going to go up. Yes, but all this is relative to a counterfactual, right? So like when we think about climate impacts, we're not saying like it's not saying like yields have to go down. It's just saying they're not go up as much as they would otherwise. So everything's in like relatives, it's counterfactual. And I think like that's the thing, that's the piece that we're trying to get here. And it's not, you know, it's like how much faster could they go up if we weren't trying to devote all our R&D to like responding to climate impacts instead of just like boosting productivity.
Frank, you had your hand up, and then
yeah, just wanted to quickly follow up on the comment that Jonas made with respect to getting in contact with breeders. I think that's a good idea to understand really their goals, which is not necessarily climate change. They don't breed for high temperatures or for high CO2 concentration situation. They don't have the facilities. The conventional breeders don't do that. They may breed for drought situation in some constellations, but even for that they don't have the facilities. That's at the more research level these investigations are done, but at the commercial breeding level you don't see that so much. Interesting in this context, being in contact with breeders, is to understand for which other goals they breed, perhaps for low input systems, perhaps for more often crops, because they become important if you move more into like resilient or sustainable systems, have legumes, have crops that you grow in mixed cropping systems, which need different traits. Those sort of information can be interesting as well from the breeders, and to understand how to include that into model projections.
Thanks, Frank.
Right.
I think we're going to need to wind it down now. I'd like to first of all thank all the speakers. A terrific workshop. I met my high expectations. Thank you, Christoph, Jonas, Nelson, Elizabeth, Kavitha, Fran, Frank, Matt. Really interesting, great variety of perspectives. All of this has been recorded, will be posted on the GLASSNET website. So let me encourage you to go to glassnet.net and explore what's available there. Also encourage the early career people, either those on here or those who you're working with, to check out GLASSNET and the possibility for visiting some of these super interesting research institutes. Subscribe to the listserv if you want to keep tabs on the next development. In the meantime, go check out the AgMIP tool. It's a very popular one. So thank you all very much, and excellent job.